How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Euler Gonzalez. Yeah, So, uh, let's take a look now at the CSS course, shall we? Okay. So, just to make a quick recap of how do we get here, right? Or how do I get here? First is because I want to understand that for sure the fundamental building block of CSS, right? So first I look at the fundamentals. That is, hey, you need to know is what CSS is, which is allow you to create design is interface and layouts in the browser, okay? And it comes with style sheets. So whether it's external, internal, or inline, you can also is cherry pick elements via selectors, whether it's tag attributes, classes, or even by pseudo classes or pseudo elements, aka as state-based selectors. So for example, when you hover on something or when you focus on an input or an element, just to mention is the most common one, you have access to these particular selectors, right? Or if you want to now add some animations or some decoration elements, for example, like after and before, or to set the placeholder of an input, just to mention again the most common ones, you can access to via these pseudo selectors in pseudo elements. And also is the functions that come up with the language. So whether it's for calculating some mathematical formulas or to scale something where you can use now the scale. All right, I want you to go from this to one. Scale is a particular element, or use a specific color functions, whether it is RGB or keywords or HSL, and more recently is now OCLA, which is a color model that looks like more how humans perceive color, not true color, which is what HSL is doing. And also is the add rules, so some specific behaviors that CSS provide. One of them is media queries, the most common one. So you can define as a set of rules to specifically be available in your web app when the viewport is reached to this limit, right? The same for view transition or that layer. When you want to apply certain rules using this specific layer. You have also keyframes to specify is the transition from one frame to another in an animation. Again, you have all other add rules, but this is the most common one. And then is the box model and the anatomy of the box model, and the properties in how you set the values of the box model, the shorthands. And last but not least is the comment. So all of this is just the fundamentals. And what is relevant in 2025 is that you need to understand what the CSS definition is. What is a CSS rule? What is the anatomy of that? And the couple add rules that are still relevant. So for example is media queries, as I mentioned before. And now there are new ones, for example, like layer in keyframe, but again, something that we're gonna see that later on in this course. Also, it's important the color, so understand the color theory and the color functions, the color formats, whether it's by keyword, if you want to create educational content, RGB, or hexadecimal, HSL, why we use HSL right now, but I'm going to now shift my attention to this new kind of color format, the overlap, which is something that I mentioned before. So also is the type of values that you can have. So whether it is percentage or pixels or red or rem root element or m, right? And when you can use each one of them, and what is the benefit of going with. The TLDR is that with rem you can now adjust the content based on the user zoom in settings, okay, providing accessibility to those web apps. So if the user have some visual impairments, right, perhaps he is myopic, or they need to use some lens with some heavy formula lens, right? So now you can actually show the content a little bigger. And also is the typography. Okay, so what is a typography? What is a font family? Which is a set of it's a set of characters that it follows. Is in the case of Roboto, 6 font weights in 2 variants, so that's great. And those variants are bold and italic. And what are those variants of fonts represent? So for example, bold when you want to show something that is important, or italic to describe, for example, something that is not native to the language, some foreign words, or you want to mention some TV series, books, or any scientific term, or even to describe is what are the thoughts of a particular person in on a book, right? In this font families, that in order to provide now a unique experience to users, we have something called as web fonts. Some of them are hosted by any of these service providers, whether it's Google, usually is them, but also you can host your own, and the whole point of this is provide branding to your web app, right? So for example, Airbnb, when you see that particular font, which is known as cerulean, something like that, you know that, oh, you are now looking is an Airbnb website. Good. So, and also to look at what are the operation that we can do with fonts. Okay, so text align, line height, or letter spacing. And all of this is just the fundamentals that are still relevant in 2025. Okay, so now as we deep into what CSS is, we explore about is the rendering logic of this layout algorithms. Specifically is looking at the browser, and now that it comes with this default presets, or it comes with these default presettings of what is so how these elements should look like. Now, in terms of follow the spec, back in the old days, a lot of these browsers doesn't do that. They implement their own specific look and feel, or CSS rule for each one of those specific elements, right? So there were no consistency across your app in all of these browsers vendor. So back in 2007, a bunch of designers create now something called as the CSS resets, that makes so once it is loaded on any browser, it acts as a blank state, right? So it defines a certain rules for how the input should look like, the how the content should be evaluated when it comes to width and the height, the layout, so on and so forth. Okay, so but as the browsers now are follow the CSS spec, so there is less need to use them. However, some of them still have some mismatch between specific elements and their layouts. And also is that how the content is evaluated, uh, especially the width and the height. So there's still need to use those. And when you look at how you can create your own CSS reset, which is just for educational purpose, you see that you can now is pass down or inherit some of those properties. One of them is the text and the other is a color, usually that is inherit. And then when two competing CSS rules, the browser find that out, so how that it resolve? Well, it has this cascade, the CSS cascade style sheets, the way of how now this competing CSS rule works, and this is now a series of tiers that the further you fall, the further you fall into that cascade, the less likely is to be for that style to be applied. Right. So the first is, hey, what are the specific keywords that are the most prevalent for that style to be applied? So, for example, it's important, or the transitions, or the opacity, and then the normal properties. Further down is where it's located. Hey, is this is located on the applications, or on the user, or on the browser, this CSS rule. The other is the specificity of these selectors. Hey, if this is the ID, or if this is the class, or pseudo elements, or by attributes, or if this is by the tag or the pseudo elements. And last but not least is the order in which those styles appear, right? So if that is appear at the top of that file, it is most likely to be applied that. So okay, this is just the CSS scale. Might be useful for you to understand that. It's still not relevant to know that despite of the current state of the web development, but I think that as you're starting to develop your applications, you're going to see the benefit, at least to understand. So then I look at how now the content is read, specifically in the traditional industry of the print media, right? That in the West it started on with the Gutenberg print back in 14th, 15th centuries, 15th century, where now that content were mainly distributed across Western cultures, right? When we read content from left to right. But as the web expands and now is capable to reach to a wider audience, so on the Middle East and the Southeast Asia, China, India, New Zealand, Africa, Mongolia, Russia. So now each one of those cultures read the content in their specific way. So the traditional way of solving this is based on the location. So the content will now is be pointed to the origin, which is the top left corner of the screen, and you read the content from left to right, right? And if you want to change that direction, you have some specific issues that you can solve that. But now as CSS evolve, is now able to provide is this writing modes, all right? So left and right and left, even top and down. And this is important because it also provides some properties to align that elements on the layout, right? So known as the block or the inline direction. So the inline direction is when you want to read the content, or is how you read how you read the flow content, all right? Depend of that culture, and the other is the block. How now all of this content stack each other, right? So that's now enter here into how these elements are now organized. Okay, how the browser see each one of those elements in a document to represent that in these visual formats, whether it's image, even speech synthesizer, that's another one. But that's not the goal of today's video. So any media, virtual media, is now representing all of these elements in the DOM, inputs, form, div, sections, articles, yada yada, like a box. And this box has an anatomy: the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. So you can think of this like do a winter walk, and you put a coat, and you can see yourself as the content, and the fluffy content here is the padding, right? The border is the external material, that thin layer of usually is polyester, something like that. And then you have the outside, which is the margin, right? So usually we have to have is 2 meters around of safe space. So the padding follow a particular padding of how you can set those values, all right? Also known as the padding shorthand. You can also we also look at particularly exercise of how you can make yourself familiar with. The other is the border. The border is quite different in fashions of padding and margin. So you have to specify what is the border style first. Is the only required, and then you can specify the width as well as the color. And also you can use another property, which is the outline. This is not part of the box model. This is not part of the layout calculation. And it is used for accessibility technologies, right? When you want to now help those persons to navigate your website, right? That's actually important, by the way, absolutely. Even though that I have my capability at the top, I sometimes want to browse the app using is my keyword, for example, and that sometimes is quite annoying. In any way, so and then I look at the margin. So margins follow the same formats as padding. So margin has some intrinsic behaviors, okay? For example, like negative margins, and how in these margins we can also now collapse elements, or known as the margin collapse. Before going into that, so this is just the anatomy of the box model, and then now how the box width and height is calculated. So before going into this, we need to understand that by default, the browser, when you put all of these elements, it follows a normal flow or a flow layout, which is the way of how now all of these elements are stacking each other. And these have three blocks. So the first is the inline, which now the content takes all the content is sits right there. It doesn't want to make any fuss. The content line break, right? And this is used for any paragraph or even image, canvas, and videos that they are, despite that technically are now block elements that you can resize its dimensions. With inline you can't. there's some nuance of working with those elements, especially the browser gives now this little height for those elements in this layout. So if you want to remove that, you just say, hey, this line height of this element is just 0. All right. Or when you're stacking elements in the flow layout, if you put a space on the markdown, the browser is going to add some specific space. So if you want to get rid of that, just put all of those elements close to each other. This is exclusively for the flow layer, particularly this inline elements. And the other is the block elements, that it takes all the available space. All right, it's greedy, it takes all the available horizontal space. And with this, you also, I also have is the inline element, or the inline block element. So internally it behaves like a block, but externally as an inline element. So in order to us working with this box, all right, and how, for example, we can now center elements, you can use now is margin to do so with the auto property. This value auto allows you to now, so it's a greedy value, right? It takes all the available space in a particular direction. So in the case of block elements, you can use that to actually center that content on left and right, so horizontally. Now, when it comes to calculate is the dimension of those boxes, the width and the height. A lot of the time, when you want to pass down the percentage, so by default, the width is, in order to calculate that via percentage or auto, it is calculated based on the patterned elements, right? Is by default, the width is look up the tree, where now the height is look down the tree. So with the width, we have is two type of measurements, or two type of values here. Whether it's width and height, we have is the measurements, which is the pixel, the percentage, and the element, and you also have the keywords. So with percentage, which is now based on look up the tree to define is the width of that element. The keywords is, for example, you have now the mean width, the main width, the max, the mean content, the max content, or the fit content. So max content is gonna look down the children elements and take the widest element, and that'll be the width. The max content is, well, it's going to take all the available space horizontally, all right? And the fit content is only the width of that children element, or the content elements. So in the case of height, because width is looking up the tree and height behave pretty much like the mean, the max, the mean content, all right, value, which is, hey, it's going to now stay as small as possible, the height, and it's going to derive the value is based on the children's. So anytime that you want, for example, this set the height of your, or a particular element, to put a background, a color background or an image background, so that needs to be passed down from the root elements, okay, from the HTML, and then for all of the elements that or the parent elements, all right, needs to pass down that height as a percentage. So because mobile browsers have the address bar and the footer as part of the viewport height, if you use, for example, values like v height, it will take all the available space, and your content will be a little bit taller to fit that viewport, the viewable area. So browsers now fix this by providing you a something known as a SVG, a small viewport. So now the content actually fit in those mobile devices. So I mentioned this because when you're working with React applications or Next.js or any other applications or any other framework up there, this knowledge is still relevant for that. So this is how the width and the height algorithm is calculated. Makes sense. And also is now how the margins, which is the specific behavior of this particular layout, the flow layout, when it comes to determining is the margins, is have an inherent behavior. It collapses. So they have several of these rules. I just want to mention the most common one. So for example, margins are collapsed vertically, okay? And the idea is, it's pretty simple. So margins are going to collapse. So you have two elements that have margins side by side, and they now collapse into each other. So this is vertically. The bigger margin wins. And among others, properties that I don't remember right now. But these are the most common ones, right? There are also a lot of margins. Again, all of these behaviors are applied to this flow layout because CSS behave much like a set of mini languages rather than a language itself. So this come out with several of these layout modes or layout algorithm. Here you have is the normal flow. You can also opt into the positioning, which is something that I'm going to see in today's video. The other is the flexbox, the grid, and so on and so forth. Okay? But at least those that I mentioned. So all of this all of that was the first model. The rendering logic, to get ourselves familiar, is with the CSS fundamentals on how now, back in the old days, we write CSS code. All right, and I'm talking about is in the early 2000s, but now also because the flow layout is making very hard to avoid 2 pixels are on the same spot, right? When you need to break out of the box, we have is the positioning layout. So instead of using display, we're using now is the relative, the position property here. So this position property that have several of these layouts algorithm. So you have the relative, you have the position, you have the sticky, and the fix. Also you have is the static and initial when you want to opt out from that layout mode. Okay, if you want to opt in, you use now the position with relative, absolute, sticky, and fix. So first we look at the relative, right? And when you do that, it might look like you don't do anything, but in fact it sets 2 property. First is, all right, that's interesting because I in half an hour actually summarize all of this content in a very precise fashion. Okay, I will be right back. All right, and we're back. Yeah, what I did is just to put at the oven my lunch. Right now is 9 a.m. Yeah, I'm going to eat very early my lunch. I have a protocol that I follow to eat twice a day, no more, no longer. I am on a fasting state. I got 36 hours roughly, 38 hours. So in any case, here we are, okay? Talking about is the relative position And when you set that to relative, when you opt into the relative position, despite that it looks like that doesn't apply anything, but in fact it does two things. First is enables additional CSS property and set constraint to the children elements. So the first one is you can have access to these top right, bottom left properties that it allows you to move that element out of the normal flow. All right. And as I look at this, for example, this, right? It allows you to now move that element out of the normal flow, and position doesn't impact layout. So you might wonder why this is important. I can use now margin to actually modify is that. But position doesn't impact layout. AKA now you can is overlapping several elements to occupy the same pixel on the screen. So why this is important? Why do you want sometimes even to go with, right? Well, it is useful when you want to now is add a specific content to behave to add a specific content that breaks the normal flow. All right. So for example, is mathematical notations. Just to mention something like that, right? For example, in this case, so mathematical notations and stuff like that. And when you want to move now elements, or when you want to position elements based on the anchor elements, again, something we're gonna see that later on. But this is relative position. Then I look at the absolute position, okay, where with relative, everything is laid out in an orderly fashion. And this refers to the flow. But now with absolute position, we can break out of elements out of the normal flow. AKA, now we can is put elements in, or we can now put elements on top of our content. We can stack content each other. So this absolute position is useful in tooltips, exactly in tooltips, drop down models. I'm not a big fan of model. They're actually quite annoying to the web, especially as a user, right? All of this model requested by user is likely to starting to close each one of them, and anyway. But models, all right. Models or decorative elements that needs to be stuck in a particular position and is stacking multiple elements in the same place, like a deck of cards. So this, again, you opt in to get into, right? These elements, you may wonder, where does it anchor, right? So the placement based on this is on the frame. And because you can now move this element here, all right? This is, so it is position or it is placement, it is location, will be based on the closest pattern relative elements. AKA, if you don't define any relative patterns, it's gonna take the viewport, right? So in this case, if I say something like this and remove that, let me remove this, right? It's now say, oh, all right, so the frame or the place where I'm gonna put this absolute element, it'll be is now as the viewport. However, when we set now position relative, it actually anchored to the closest relative pattern elements, right? So this is great because we can also is position of element absolute based on that anchor, right? And then move that around as we see fit. Using is the top, right, bottom, and left. And another cool thing of that is that by default, the top left corner is put it off the top left. Okay. uh, and when you use now absolute positioning, uh, yeah, when you use now uh, absolute position without the top, without setting the relative, the position CSS attributes, top left and right bottom, okay, it's gonna now put that element there. Exactly. It's not now put that elements there. It sits in the default flow position. That's quite interesting, by the way. The default placements of this. And also is the effect on layout. This point is a bit less obvious, but maybe even more important. When we set something to absolute position, we pull out of the flow. We pull out of the flow and it will anchor to the closest pattern relative element. It will exactly, we'll put elements out of the flow and anchor that to the closest relative pattern element. So when the browser is layout elements, it is effectively pretend that absolute positioning element doesn't exist. So they are incorporeal. You can stick your hands right through them like a holograms or a ghost. Okay. To drive the point home, here are 3 paragraphs that has been set to be absolute position. The browser starts by putting that first paragraph in its natural position at the top of the document, but because it is absolute, it is still considered that empty space. Next, the second paragraph get additional natural position, which is also right at the top since the container is effectively empty. And this process will continue for each provide absolute elements. Being able to take elements out of the flow is super handy, for example, for drop down or models, right? When you want to make those elements to float above that. And then you have now the collapsing pattern, right? I wasn't well aware of this collapsing patterns. So while often the ability to take element out of the flow is useful, there are times when it can be annoying. So for example, if you have now a child that is, for example, if you set this position relative, what do you think will happen? Well, it's going to be anchored to that element, okay? But the collapsing patterns, collapsing patterns. So if the pattern is too small, right? And you put that on exactly. If the pattern is too small and you put now an element, or you anchor an absolute element to that, what happens is that it will anchor that element to the collapsing pattern. You may be wonder, how do we fix this? Is there a way to stop the pattern from collapsing while still using absolute position on the child? Unfortunately, I am not aware of any way to do this, at least not without resorting to a bunch of hackages. But I sort of think of this is a wrong question. In general, absolute position is intended to be used in situations when you don't want it to affect its surrounding layout. If you find yourself running into this problem over and over, it is likely that you are reaching for absolute position in situations where another layout, flex, box, and grid will be more appropriate. So collapsing patterns. It's like you're using is okay. So when you want to use the absolute element in a pattern, and this pattern is small, all right, the position will collapse to that. Collapse. Collapsing pattern. Yeah, this something was not. I didn't quite get this. All right, definitely didn't quite get this. Because it's what is collapsing. What is collapsing in CSS? Right. So margin collapse is when two elements are side by side and their margins collapse. But here you're talking about is when the pattern and the other elements collapse. So they overlapping. It's a behavior where the vertical margins, top and bottoms, are adjacent block and elements into single margins. Exactly, but this is for in absolute position. In the context of absolute position refers to the behavior where a pattern height collapses to zero when all its child elements are positioned absolute, as they are removed from the normal document. This occurs because absolute positioning elements no longer contribute to the layout of the pattern container, making it appear as though the pattern has no height, no content or height. So when you talk about collapsing pattern, you say when a pattern doesn't have any height and you use that to anchor position elements, it looks like, okay, exactly, the pattern container heights collapse to zero when all its child elements are positioned absolutely, as they remove from the normal flow. So the pattern container will collapse unless it has an explicit height or width defined, which prevents the collapse by establishing a physical size of the container. Okay, so if you specify a height here, right? If you specify is a height here, it's going to look like it's not collapsing. All right, or in other words, exactly, collapsing pattern. If you don't provide any height here, all right, so that pattern will look like, so it is collapsing and all of the elements are positioned to that as they are removed from the normal document flow. So in any case, this is a very rare edge case, even though that sometimes you might find yourself in that scenario. But yeah.
So here we have an absolutely positioned element. As it stands, it's just kind of hanging.
Exactly. Absolute position, collapsing patterns here. So, yeah, collapsing pattern. Well, often available. All right. We have a pink box sitting within a black border patterns. So for example is this. What the French does. It's quite slow. So absolute size.
Hanging out near the top left corner of the viewport. And I have this display property. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask you the question. What do you suppose happens if I change this element to have a display property of block? Well, yeah, we can try it. And nothing really changes. And I suppose it makes sense, right? We're applying these styles to a div, and the default value of display for divs is block. So then, what do you suppose happens if I change it to inline? Well, we can try that too. And anticlimactically, nothing happens. And this is one of those common points of confusion for people. So I really want to take a moment and talk about it. Different layout modes use different properties in different ways. We've been talking.
absolute size. Different properties. Different properties use different layouts in several different ways.
Talking a lot about flow layout for people, so I really want to take a moment and talk about it. Different layout modes use different properties in different ways.
Exactly. Different layout modes. Different layout modes use different properties. Use different properties in different ways, and I wasn't well aware of this. You know, different layout modes uses different properties. Use different properties in different ways. So, for example, here the position algorithm enables this additional CSS property and with some set of with a set of constraint.
We've been talking a lot about flow layout in this course so far, and in flow layout, display block and display inline are vital ingredients to the ultimate layout for the element. With positioned layout, it doesn't quite matter as much. When we're talking about absolute positioning, this value isn't used at all. The algorithm doesn't care what the value of display is unless we set it to none. If we set it to none, then it hides, like it does in every layout algorithm. But in terms of display inline, display block, that distinction doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a block level absolute element. Where this gets a little bit muddy is around relative positioning, because with relatively positioned elements, you actually can change the display value and it has an effect. Relative positioned elements inherit a lot of their layout from whatever the layout mode otherwise used is. Relative is kind of like this weird middle ground between positioned layout and whatever else it is, whether it's flow layout or flexbox. So that's like a bit of an exception. But when we're talking about absolutely positioned elements, and sticky, and fixed, and in general just every layout mode, every element is rendered using a single layout mode, and different layout modes use different properties.
And every single layout mode is using different properties.
So, this property has no effect for absolutely positioned elements, but then that opens a new question, which is, how does an absolutely positioned element determine its size, right? Because in flow layout, a block level element is...
Exactly. So, that's a good question. How an absolute element determine its size? Okay.
Greedy and will expand. An inline element goes with the flow. We've talked about that. What about absolute elements? Well, we can kind of get a sense from what we're seeing over here that it's closer to inline, but not exactly. An absolutely positioned element wants to be as small as it can, because in general, this is kind of what you want, right?
Exactly. So absolute position, absolute position are small as you can, right? So absolute position size is small as possible, and it makes sense. When you want to put things on a dashboard, right? When you want to put things on a dashboard, you have a small sticky box here.
But usually, absolutely positioned elements are meant to kind of stick in a given spot.
So it makes sense, since usually absolute position is sticky is stick into one specific spot, right?
And you don't want them to be growing. You kind of just want the element to be whatever it is in whatever place you put it.
Exactly. So you don't want to that element to grow. You just want you don't want to that element to grow. You just wants to exactly. You just want to you don't want to that element to grow. You just want to be as the size.
To be growing, you kind of just want the element to be whatever it is.
Exactly. So you don't want to that element to be growing. Yeah, you don't want to that element to be growing. You just want to be to where they are.
In whatever place you put it. So
where they are in whatever in whatever place you put it, right?
It's going to shrink to fit the content. But what if we have a lot more content? And this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. I've given it a distance from the left, but I haven't.
So for example, in this case here, so what happened when
Shrink to fit the content. But what if we have a lot more content?
Exactly. But what if we have exactly? But what if we have much more content, right? So for example, in this image, right? So what if we have much more content? As you can see now, the elements is positioning absolute with top and left 32 pixels from the top right, top left corner of the screen.
And this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. I've given it a distance from the left, but I haven't given it a distance from the right. And you might think it would just grow and grow and grow and grow, but it actually stops once it hits the right edge of the viewport. To be a little bit more precise, it's stopping when it hits the edge of its containing block. And
exactly. So here, it stops when it encounters. So here, it stopped growing until it hits the containing block.
And this is one of those hidden mechanisms we're going to talk about much more very soon. For now, we can just think of it as the viewport. So this is kind of interesting, right? It grows until it reaches a point where it can't grow anymore.
So it grows until a point it can grow anymore, right?
While still fitting in the viewport, and then it forces a line wrap.
It grows until a point it can't grow anymore until it fits the viewport.
And if I was to add a distance from the right, if I was to say
is this
a right 32 pixels.
That's right. So if you add now a right to this, so if we add right 32 pixels, right, like this, okay, so it makes a lot of sense. So
well, now instead of it going all the way to the edge of the container, it's going to go until it reaches 32 pixels away from the container, and then it line wraps. What do you suppose happens though if it can't line wrap? So let's imagine.
Exactly. And there's another. So what if we can't? Or what if the content can line wrap. So if the content is large, okay, if the content is too large, right, it will overflow then.
That I remove all of the spaces, right? And we're going to talk much more about this algorithm in the future. Essentially, the way the line wrapping algorithm works is it looks for soft wrap opportunities. And this is things.
So line wrap algorithm works by looking at the
like the way the line wrapping algorithm works is it looks for soft wrap opportunity.
The line wrap algorithm works by looking at soft wraps opportunities.
And this is things like spaces or dashes, right?
Soft wraps opportunity, like spaces, dashes.
Anything that it can wrap without kind of breaking the flow of the word.
Anything that can wrap without breaking the flow of the content or of the word in this case.
So when I do this, and I'm almost done here, I do kind of break my editor, which is a little bit unfortunate. Maybe this will be fixed by the time you watch this. But something interesting happens over here. The box, right, the rectangle is still going to take up the same size. It's going to be 32 pixels from either edge of the viewport, but the content is now introducing this horizontal scroll bar. And it makes sense because we've given it kind of an impossible situation. We've said that it should be 32 pixels from the left, 32 pixels from the right, and then it should also contain its contents because that's how elements like to work, right? That's how the algorithm works. It grows.
Exactly. So here we give like an impossible condition. Make the or put this absolute element with 32 pixels on exactly. Put this element put this element 32 pixel below the top corner. Exactly. Put these elements 32 pixels below the top corner and 32 pixels and 32 pixels and 30 yeah put this absolute element 32 pixels below the top corner and 32 pixels on the sides, on right and left corner. Exactly. And 32 pixels and push 32 pixels on the right and the left corner. Exactly. While containing all of the element, while containing all of the content, right?
And shrinks as needed based on the content size, but it can't really do that here. It can't grow to contain the contents because the contents are too large. So that's kind of a lot of independent pieces of information. Let's see if we can connect those dots and tell a compelling story about what this algorithm is doing. And I think the first takeaway I have is that absolutely positioned elements are extremely compliant. And what I mean by that is they really want to follow the properties that we give it. So in this case, I have this really large, really unwieldy bit of content.
Okay.
content, but the box is kind of staying firm at exactly the priorities that we've given it. So we've said left 32, right 32, and that box is stable. And the same thing is true, by the way, if I use width instead. So if I was to say width 200 pixels, our box is going to be 200 pixels wide no matter what the content is doing. In general, it will try and line wrap the content, right? That's kind of its ideal, but it always makes sure to respect the priorities that we give it. If we give it some leeway, though, so if I don't set a width and I don't imply a width by setting both a left and a right, well, then the box is going to grow as large as it has to contain the contents within its own environment. So this box doesn't want to break out of the viewport, right? It doesn't want to get so large that it doesn't fit, but it is willing to allow its content to overflow. So if the content is really big, if there's no white space, or maybe it's a really large image, then that image will be allowed to overflow without the box itself changing dimensions.
Okay, so the TLDR is that absolute position will respect will strictly respect the boundaries set by the properties, regardless the size of the content. Regardless of the size of the content. Interesting. Okay. So no matter how big the content is, no matter the size of the content, the position element will respect those constraints. Okay. And centering tricks. Okay. So if for some reason you use now is auto and auto and auto in all of these positions, and auto and auto and auto, if you don't specify is the width, of course it's not going to render anything because the content is empty. All right, if we put now some content, it add that, right? If we put it here, it say, hey, I want you to take all the available space on the top and on the left and on the right and bottom for that, right? Hungry margins, margin outer here. And I also want you to now make the margin here outer, right? So auto is taking all the available space here. So margin is say, hey, take all the elements, take all so take the horizontal and left, take the horizontal and vertical space of this element based on its containing box, and here's where you're going to center that. So for example, if you pass now 0 and 0 and 0 and 0, it actually going to center that element. So if you don't even specify content here, or you say 2, 3, right? Because we're specifying is this, that's what it's doing, right? Okay, absolute positioning equal distance from each edge, ideally 0 pixels. Ideally 0 pixels. Ideally 0 pixels. See. All right. So is this right? Centering trick. Okay. Is centering trick of the absolute position, right? So we have seen that we can specify the distance from the edge like this. So we can specify the distance from edges like this, right? But it is this way. So now, absolute position elements have another trick up their sleeve. Okay, you have another trick up their sleeve. So absolute position. Yeah, absolute position have another, or absolute positioning elements have another trick up their sleeve. Have another trick up their sleeve. Up their sleeve. Right? We can use this property to centering elements. We can use these properties to center an element. Right? So
this is kind of interesting. We have this pink box, and we haven't given it a size, but we have given it a distance from each of the 4 cardinal directions. And so what it has to do in order to comply with this is it has to dynamically calculate a size that essentially is the entire width of the viewport minus 100 pixels and the entire height minus 100 pixels. And this is all well and good, right? We're able to be strict with the position if we're willing to be loose with the size. But what do you suppose happens if we try to be strict about both of those things at the same time? Maybe we've had a bad day and we want to exact a little revenge on the computer. So let's see what happens. We'll give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Thankfully, the computer doesn't explode, but we don't really get, we're not complying with all of these requirements, and of course we're not, because it's impossible, right? Unless our viewport happens to be exactly 200 by 200 pixels, there's no way for it to be 100 pixels wide and stretch the entire distance so that it's only 50 pixels away from either edge. And essentially the way that it resolves this conflict is it listens to top left. It prioritizes these two sides. Usually, like those, that's the kind of origin point, and we'll see a lot of this throughout the course. Things originate from the top left. So those are the kind of prioritized sides. And it doesn't, the order doesn't matter. Like I could move top and left lower. It's not a matter of like whichever ones come first. But something interesting happens with this impossible condition if we introduce auto margins. And so we saw this a little bit in flow layout. If I set margin auto, our box moves to the very center of the viewport. And this isn't quite perfect, right? Like if we get really small, then the fact that we're still 50 pixels from the left starts causing problems. So in general, we want to set it to be 0 pixels from each side. That way it remains centered as long as it fits in the viewport. But this is kind of interesting, right? And I think it's worth revisiting the logic we talked about with auto margins in flow layout. Essentially how this works is the auto value is a hungry value. So it's going to try and grow as large as it can. And because we're setting margin to all 4 sides, right, both the left and right are both trying to grow as much as they can, and it kind of forces the element into the middle. In flow layout, this only works horizontally. It doesn't work vertically. But with position layout, with absolute positioned elements, it works in both directions, which is pretty darn cool.
And that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So here you're saying, hey, 50%, 50 pixels, and the same 50 pixel here, and same 50 pixels here, and 50 pixel here, right? Without this, so we're giving here is now an impossible condition, right? So here, we're giving it now an impossible condition. So here we are giving an impossible condition. right? Which is, hey, how you gonna do this? You know, how you going to apply or add this element and so on and so forth, right? So here we're giving is an impossible condition, okay? And that is the, so they are the four important ingredients for this trick to work. But in any case, is this. Um, so in so like like in flow layout, when we use margin with auto property, with auto value, with auto as a value, right? Auto in margin is a hungry value, as they say. In flow layout, it takes all the horizontal available space. It takes all the horizontal available space in absolute position, or in absolute position elements, right? Or in absolute position, elements, it will take, okay, in absolute position elements, okay, it will take all the available space horizontally and vertically based on the containing block. All right, based on the containing block. So for this trick to work, okay, so for this trick to work, we need we need set the position properties to 0 pixels, set a dimension, or set a fixed dimension, okay, so width and height, okay, set or opt-in the element, so opt into absolute position element, up in the absolute position element, and set margins to auto as value, or set margins to auto. Now it's starting to make sense here, because everything here is a box, including absolute position, relative position, everything is a box. And here you are taking is the margins from that, hungry margins. And hungry margins. Still relevant? Yes. Still relevant? So how do you center elements in a model or drop down or any UI floating elements? Huh? All right. models and drawers and dialog boxes. Exactly. Models and dialogues. Models uh, and dialogues. Dialogues. All right. And then we have the inset property. Interesting. The inset property. So instead of manually use the absolute, instead of manually use the top, right, left, and top, right, bottom, and left properties, we can use inset to set all of them to set all of them with the same value, aka like this. So for example, like this. And this is equivalent to say this. Okay. Yeah, this is equivalent to say this. Okay. All right. Okay, and then we look at now containing block. In CSS, every HTML element has a containing block. A containing block is a rectangle that forms the bound of an element on the element's container. Here we're not talking about content or the box model. Here we're talking about something called the elements container. In flow layout, elements are contained by their patterns. For example, this paragraph is contained by its pattern. To be precise, the paragraph is contained by a containing block. The size and the shape of the pattern elements contain box. This is the containing block. So to be precise, the paragraph is contained by a containing block. The size and the shape of the pattern elements, the size and shape of the pattern element content box. Flow layout use containing blocks to figuring out where on the screen to place the elements. Okay, so I'm using is the containing block as a way to know as a browser where these elements live, where I'm gonna put them. When it comes to absolute positioning, however, containing blocks works a little bit different. When we set the position of an element using top, left, right, and bottom, we are positioning the element based on the element's containing block. Exactly. Okay. In the flow layouts, right? The size of the in the flow layout, the containing block is determined by its pattern. All right, but in the absolute position, it is based on the elements containing block. or AKA, is the closest parent, is the closest relative parent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In our element set top left, the element will be nested in the top left corner of the containing block. The $1,000,000 question is, how is an absolute element containing block calculated? Unlike in flow layout, absolute elements are necessary containing by their direct parent. They are a bit of like rebellious teenagers. In this way, they won't necessarily pay any attention to their parents. Here's an example of an absolute element ignoring its parent. Exactly. But okay, the containing block. So in CSS, every HTML element has a containing block. Okay. So okay, containing block that determine its size. Okay. Or yeah, containing block. To be precise, the paragraph is contained by a containing block. The size by a containing block, the size and shape of the parent element's content box. So the containing block here. So in CSS, in CSS, every HTML element is contained by a parent, or is contained by has or in CSS every element has a containing element, right? A containing element, right? A containing block is a rectangle, or a containing block is a rectangle that forms the bounds around the element's parent container. Is a rectangle that forms around the elements exactly the elements the elements container. Okay, in flow layouts, elements are contained by their parents. Exactly. In flow, okay. So in flow layouts, elements are contained by their parents. Okay, elements are contained by their parents. So for example, this paragraph is contained by the parent section. So this paragraph is contained by the section element, right? Which is this. Okay. But this is how it works in flow layout, right? Flow layout use containing blocks to figuring out where. So flow layout use containing blocks to figure it out where to put the elements. Okay, on the screen. And they use now the parent container as a block. Okay, but now when it comes to absolute positioning, when it comes to absolute position or positioning uh, this block containing blocks work a little bit different. So exactly when it comes to absolute positioning, it is uh, based on the element. Exactly, it is based on the element. It is based on the elements containing block. It is based on the elements containing block. Mm-hmm. So how the containing block is calculated? So how the containing block is calculated? How the containing block that French how is the containing block calculated? Right? Okay. How is the containing block calculated? All right. Okay. Okay. Um well, it's pretty obvious. So absolute elements can only be contained by other elements positioned. So absolute elements can only be contained by others elements. Absolute elements can only be contained by others position, relative position by others elements using the position. But this is interesting. It means that is using the position layer by other elements. It's that the absolute elements can only be contained by other element using the position layer. Right? And that is when my intuitions is wrong. So if we add position relative to the parent class, it flips the child's containing block, and will be now it will now be contained contained by the parent. Okay, which is this. So you get the idea, and then you put it now as it is. All right, makes a lot of sense. All right. Here's how the algorithm works. When deciding where to place an absolute position elements, it crawls up the tree looking for a position ancestor. The first one it finds will provide a containing block. What if it doesn't find one? In many of the examples we have seen so far that aren't any position ancestor. So for example, if I use not relative, if I use now fix, if I use now static, which is opt out the, so make these elements opt out the position layout, or static, or initial. So I want to opt out the position layout. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. Holy shit. But if I want to append, what it is by using is absolute, right? Exactly. Whether it's using absolute or relative of or sticky, or relative, like that. Holy shit, nigga. Holy fuck, nigga. Holy fuck, nigga. Holy French toast, nigga. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. So here's how the algorithm works. Okay, so here is how the algorithm works, right? It's going to look up for so when deciding when to place an absolutely positioning element, it crawls up to the 3 exactly. So when deciding to uh, position an absolute element, uh, is going to crawl. It crawls up through the tree. It crawls. It crawls. Okay. It crawls up to the tree. Okay. It crawls up. It crawls up. Right. Through. It crawls up through the tree, looking for a positioning ancestor. Exactly. It crawls up through the tree, looking for. It crawls up. It crawls up. Crawl. Crawl. Exactly. It crawls up. Crawl in Spanish, it is in Spanish es gateo. Como gatear. Arrastrarse. Exacto. It crawls up. It crawl. Ahora arrastrarse. Marcha lenta. Camino a gata. Reptar. Reptar, bro. Exacto. Está reptando ahí. Ah, reptando. Crawl. Gatea, se arrastra, exacto. It crawls up. It crawls up through the tree, or it crawls down. It crawls up through the tree, looking for a position ancestor. Looking for a positioned ancestor. Positioned element ancestor. Holy moly. The first one it find will provide a containing block. The first one it found will be the containing block. Holy moly, bro. What if it doesn't find one? Okay. What if it doesn't find one? Right? Or no, but here. So what if it doesn't find one? Well, it's going to use, in this case, the element will be positioning according to the initial containing block. Okay. So in this case, will be positioned according to the initial containing block. Which is the viewport. Which is the box size of the viewport. Right at the top of the document. Right at the top of the document. Here's another example, or box is placed in a Russian nesting doll type collection like this. But it's the closest containing pattern position, right? So it is the closest containing pattern position. So here is another example. So you draw all of this, but now what is on the relative position. What if you say in sticky, right? What if you say is the absolute, right? It's gonna put that, right, down there. But if you find, so the first it find, because it's relative block, that's what it is. So the first containing block, okay, the first containing block, so you're going to crawl up through the tree looking for a positioned ancestor, and the first one, it'll be as the containing block. Holy moly, bro. If it doesn't matter how many padding elements are wrapping the child, it will ignore all of them until it finds a positioned element. And the first one, it doesn't have to be relative as seen here, but it has to be used a position layer, absolute, fixed, or stick, and it will also work. One last quick point, the pink box ignores the padding of the containing block. It sits right upon the border. So the elements sits right at the border, right at the top border of the containing element of the containing block. Okay. It sits right up against that, even though each of these boxes has padding. The way to think about this, padding is using flow layer calculation, and absolute elements are taken out of the flow. Those rules won't apply. So padding here only works for flow layer. Holy shit, nigga. Exactly. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.